The ballots have been delivered. Now British Columbians have to decide what to do with them. The government is asking people to vote in a referendum on native treaty issues. A referendum so controversial that native leaders are asking people not to take part. A poll conducted by CGT Research International for CBC News in Vancouver took the temperature of the voters. 87% of those polled said resolving the native treaty issue in BC is important. Nearly 60% of those people said it's very important to resolve the issue. Just over 40% said they're opposed to holding the referendum. 36% are in favor. Nearly 50% of those polled said they plan to complete and return their referendum ballot. A quarter of respondents won't return the ballots or will return a spoiled ballot. For BC's Native people, the questions are decades old and fundamental to their culture. For some non-Native people, they strike at the very meaning of democracy. Who owns the land which people call home? Who has the right to make a living from that land? Duncan McHugh visited a community where the referendum has people wrestling with those questions.
They were delivered across British Columbia this month. 2.2 million ballots that will define the future of Aboriginal people in this province. In places like Port Alberni, a few hours' drive north of Victoria, voters are wrestling with complicated questions about treaty talks.
Parks and protected areas should be maintained for the use and benefit of all British Columbians. Yes or no?
The existing tax exemptions for Aboriginal people should be phased out. Yes or no?
Private property should not be expropriated for treaty settlements. Yes or no?
Aboriginal self-government should have the characteristics of local government with powers delegated from Canada and British Columbia. Yes or no?
Controversial questions, to say the least. Some have refused to vote at all. Instead, they bring their ballot to Chief Judith Sayers of the Hupacasath First Nation.
We're getting ballots from all over British Columbia.
She's collected thousands of ballots as a way to register protest against the referendum.
Wonderful. You want to add it to our official box here?
Okay.
It's the single most destructive process that I have ever seen in my lifetime.
Sayers has emerged as a leading voice in a chorus of opposition to the referendum. First, she went to court to try and stop the whole thing. That failed.
Our witness is to burning 3 official ballots.
She's burned ballots alongside other Native leaders, sending a clear message to Victoria.
People should not have the right to vote on my rights, ever. With everything that's in me, I say it's wrong. And, that's why I've taken so much time to fight this.
Next stop is the lawyers.
The fight, and it's an old one, is literally in her blood. Her grandfather, Dan Watts, was one of a group of Hupacasath chiefs who met with a Queen's agent in 1922. Like Indians throughout BC, they insisted they owned the land because it had never been ceded. They didn't get far.
I look at all those men standing there and talking to the governments and wanting something, for their children and for me and my children and our children yet unborn. And they weren't able to achieve that, which is why we're here today.
7 decades later, treaty talks finally began in BC. Since 1992, over 4 dozen First Nations and the governments of Canada and BC have spent over $500 million trying to figure out whose land is whose. No treaties have been signed. There was the Nisga'a deal in 1998, but that was the product of almost 30 years of talks that were separate from the BC treaty process.
Why is he afraid to have a full and honest debate about every clause of this treaty?
Gordon Campbell, then leader of the opposition, tried to stop that treaty in court. His argument had support from those who believed that some of the Nisga'a government's new powers were illegal because they couldn't be trumped by Ottawa or Victoria.
I think it's a very sad day.
He lost. When Campbell came to power last year, he scrapped the appeal of the Nisga'a case. On land claims, the Liberals prefer the opinion of the people over those of the court.
And you can count on these commitments being carried out.
The BC Liberals say the referendum, all 8 questions, will provide direction to provincial treaty negotiators. Some call the referendum an exercise in direct democracy. Others call it out-and-out racism. What's clear is, here in Port Alberni, the business of being neighbors is becoming terribly complex.
Over the years, the Hupacasath and their non-native neighbors have lived side by side, but haven't had much to do with each other until recently.
We're all in this valley together. Why don't we get together and look at one vision?
Little regional planning goes on here without Sayers and the Hupacasath at least being consulted. They're becoming an economic force in the valley. They're transforming the old city hall into a traditional welcome site. They're running a woodlot. There's talk about turning this hill into a granite quarry.
There's lots of things going on out there with the referendum case.
But their biggest investment is in treaty talks. The Hupacasath alone have spent over $700,000 on negotiations, money toward things like lawyers, mapping, consultants. Judith Sayers says the referendum will kill those talks because there's no room for negotiation.
What we're trying to look for as First Nations is providing for the future. How much land are we going to need? How much resource are we going to need? How much money are we going to need to be able to have a good foundation to build for the future? And what's being offered just isn't enough.
This is the voice of government in town. Gillian Trumper, town mayor for 17 years, now the Liberal member of the legislature. She and Chief Sayers agreed to disagree on most issues, but both are frustrated by the pace of treaty talks.
Over those years, maybe that money could have gone to other things that were necessary within the band communities. And we really achieved nothing. Referendum questions.
He thought it should be considered illegal.
Trumper believes the referendum will speed up talks by providing her government with a mandate from the people.
Absolutely not racist. Their rights they have rights under the Constitution. We have a responsibility to get the treaties settled, and it's an opportunity for people to voice their views on it and to give direction to the government.
Mr. Speaker, these are not motherhood questions. They are real questions about real issues.
The government says it wants direction because the issues are contentious and the stakes are high. Referendum results will impact Aboriginal self-government and economic independence. Take questions 1 and 2, which essentially ask whether private property should be expropriated and whether companies should be compensated for leases and licenses that get interrupted. A yes vote would scuttle Hupacasath attempts to control more of their traditional territory, which is about half the size of PEI. Right now, they occupy less than 1% of it. What land isn't owned privately is covered by tree farm licenses. There's little vacant crown land left. If the Hupacasath want any of it back, they must prove they've used it since time immemorial. Brandy Lauder is the band's forester. She's hunting for what are called CMTs, culturally modified trees.
You got it going up the one side.
CMTs are scarred trees, evidence that her ancestors stripped bark here for use as clothing or rope. If Brandy can prove this is a CMT, it strengthens their claim to this land, or at least compensation for what was taken. So the questions on land use got her pretty upset.
For the Hupacasath perspective, sitting right in the middle of a city, being surrounded